I wanted to start by saying hello and welcome to everybody. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Phoebe Tickell and I'll be facilitating the webinar. I'm the course development manager at Capricorns. So I work together with Fritjof and Mira on the Capricorns team to do things like publicize the course, organize events, engagements like this webinar, and manage partnerships with universities and organizations. This is a new series of webinars that we have started called Capricorns Webinars. And they're basically a series of live online conversations between Fritjof and friends and colleagues about their work and life. And we're planning on running a series of these roughly monthly. And the next one is planned for early September, so just over a month's time. And our first guest is Stephen Bingler, but I'll allow Fritjof to introduce Stephen in a second. So just before we launch in, I thought I'd just quickly introduce people to the Zoom platform for those of you who haven't used Zoom before. Zoom is a video communication platform that we use for video conferencing. And in this context, Fritjof, Stephen, and I will be the only people with their microphones available, so with access to microphones. And while everybody has access to video, but 45 minutes into the call, we will open up the floor for questions to Fritjof and Stephen. And the way I will be collecting questions is in the chat window. So during the course of the interview, if you have a question or a question comes to mind, please do write it into the chat window and I will make sure to be collecting those during the course of the call and then read those out to Fritjof and Stephen 45 minutes in. And so to just give you a rough idea of the schedule, we just had a little 5-minute welcome from me. I'm about to pass to Fritjof, where he's going to introduce the webinar and Stephen and talk for about 10 minutes. Then Fritjof and Stephen will start their conversation and we plan for that to run for about 40 minutes. During that time, I'll be collecting questions from all of you. And then the final 20 minutes will be the question and answer time, and I'll read out the questions and let Stephen and Fritjof answer, and then we'll just wrap up with a final 5 minutes. So that's actually a total webinar time of 80 minutes, not 60 minutes as originally planned. So we're planning on finishing at 20 past the next hour. So if you're in England, that's 20 past 7. If you're in California, that's 20 past 11. Right, so, and lastly, before we launch, I just wanted to remind you that registration for the fall 2018 Capra course opened just 2 weeks ago. And we've already got about a quarter of the course filled, and it's a very international group, so we're quite excited about this next edition. So if you're interested in signing up, just go to the capricorns.net website. Capricorns.net /info is where you can find things like how to register and how much that costs. Great. With this, I will hand over to Fritjof, who will introduce our guest. Fritjof, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Phoebe. Hello, everybody, and greetings from Berkeley, California. It's wonderful to hear Phoebe welcome people from all over the world, really, and to follow how they log in. I just love this technology and this opportunity to just converse across the globe. It's really something absolutely fantastic. And it's my particular pleasure today to introduce Stephen Bingler, who is an architect and founder and CEO of a company called Concordia. Concordia is a community-centered architectural studio in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I don't want to talk about Concordia anymore because in this webinar, we're going to explore what community-centered architecture means with Stephen. And I myself, I'm not sure about the term, what it means in detail. So I really look forward to this conversation. And to start it off, let me relate this to the systems perspective that we develop in the Capra course. Those of you who have taken the course may remember that I discuss the nature of human organizations in the course. And I make the point that every human organization has a dual nature. It is a social institution designed for a particular purpose, making money for a corporation, disseminating knowledge for a university, keeping the faith for a church, and so on. So it's designed for a particular purpose, but at the same time, these organizations are always communities or collections of communities of people who build relationships, who help one another, and who make their daily activities meaningful at a personal level. And from a systems point of view, it's important to realize that the aliveness of an organization lies in these so-called communities of practice. And Stephen, it seems to me that you can say apply a similar perspective to architecture. A building is designed for a particular purpose, including often the prestige of the architect. And at the same time, it is a kind of vessel for various communities. And you, Stephen, seem to emphasize this community aspect in particular. So if you could tell us, have you always done this since you became an architect? And how do you do it? Please give us some concrete examples.
All right, I'll be happy to do that. First of all, Concordia, a little bit of history is Concordia, of course, is the Latin root of the word concord, which means harmony, and it means agreement between people. So that is actually our firm's one-word mission statement. I've always had a fascination. I was born in Virginia, and I've always had a fascination with democracy and democratic process and how this country runs, at least theoretically, on an engine that's fueled by all of the people. And so I've always been interested in how our fairly fresh 250-year-old government could always get a little bit better. Essentially, I think we're building it while we're flying it, and at this particular moment in history, some of us may be questioning whether this democratic process is actually working or not. I first got fascinated with this whole notion of interdisciplinary design and community design when I was working on a design for the Intercontinental Hotel, 400-room hotel in New Orleans. And I put together a team of people to design a courtyard, an unlikely team, you might say, that included a physicist and a mathematician, actually an algebraic topologist, a new music composer, a sculptor, a painter, and myself. And we spent some fabulous evenings together, just dreaming up what some people would call a very wacky courtyard design. And that got me to understand that the old notion of the architect is kind of on a pillar, and the best way to do it might be to do it in collaboration with other people, and particularly in collaboration with the people who would actually be using it. I liken it to barn raising. Back in the colonial days, people got together and built barns together. There was no architect of the barn, and the architect was a communal entity. So there's no one person that can build a barn. It has to be done in a collaborative way. So the outcome of that process of barn raising was more than the barn. There were a lot of relationships, and some people brought potato salad, and some people brought a hammer, and some people brought the wood, and all the people brought the things that were needed to make the barn happen. And they were doing it with each other and for each other. So at the end of the day, there was a physical object, but then there was also a cultural outcome. There was also a kind of a social outcome. There were lots of different social entities that were overlapping in that barn raising process. there was an economic outcome because everyone was dedicated to the notion of elegance. Nobody wanted to build, nobody wanted to waste any material. Nobody wanted to waste anybody's time. Everybody was dedicated to the same search for elegance and sustainability. And then there was also an educational component, because the younger people involved in the barn raising would learn how to make the joints and cut the logs, and then at the end of the day, when the time came for them to do barn raising, they would have the knowledge that they needed. So all of these domains are what I've come to understand, that community life exists within all these different domains, and within all these different domains there are different practitioners. So our work has been to try to bring these practitioners together, bring the users together, who are the people who are the experts on architecture are actually the people who are going to use them. So architects, I think, are meant to be in service of those community needs. So I think maybe an example, a good example that I would give, you've asked me to give some examples, so I have 3 examples. One example is the Henry Ford Academy in Dearborn, Michigan, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'll actually talk a little bit more about that, because I think I can lay down some ideas and principles in that discussion. And then the second project is a project in Houston, Texas. It's called the Baker Ripley Center. And it's actually a nexus of community services. It's not a building, it's a nexus of buildings that were needed to provide the kinds of services that the community had asked for. And the third one is a much larger project in Emeryville, California, Fritjof, right around the corner from where you live. And that project is similar to the previous one, the one in Houston, but at a different scale and with a different level of collaboration. So the first project that I mentioned was the Henry Ford Academy, and you asked me to talk about a building that I've designed. And I can tell you that I had a conversation years ago with Howard Gardner, who runs a program at Harvard called Project Zero, about education and multiple intelligence and different kinds of learning styles and that kind of thing. And we've designed a lot of schools, and Howard said to me, we design schools for verbal linguistic learners and mathematical logical learners, but what would it look like if we designed a school for visual spatial learners? And as a visual spatial learner, that really rung true with me. And Howard said, maybe the best school for a visual spatial person would be a museum. So the opportunity came up when I was invited to the Henry Ford Museum, which is an 80-acre site in Dearborn, Michigan, that includes a building that Henry Ford built, a 12-acre building that's got airplanes and cars and trains and everything you can think of in it. And Henry Ford also built, he collected buildings from all over the country, and he built a little village on this 80-acre site that includes the Wright Brothers bicycle shop. It includes the Menlo Park laboratory where Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and 80 other buildings like that, because he was honoring his mentor, Thomas Edison. The whole museum is dedicated to the spirit of innovation. So when the president of the museum invited me to help him figure out where we should build a school building on this site, I looked at him and I said, why would you want to build a building on this site and isolate the students from all of these beautiful artifacts and all of these beautiful learning opportunities? And so at the end of the day, we didn't build a building. We actually started off by putting it was a brand new school, so we just had the 9th grade in the beginning. And so we put the 9th grade right in the middle of that 12-acre building, and in all glass classrooms. So the people who are in the museum could see the students, and the students could see the people in the museum walking around. And even more importantly, the students could use the museum artifacts as their learning tools. Now, I will tell you that the community of practice of curators didn't think this was such a great idea at first. they said, oh my goodness, these kids are going to destroy all of our beautiful, precious objects. And not only that, I'm sure they're going to be throwing spitballs in the cafeteria at lunchtime. So whose crazy idea is it to bring all these kids into our precious museum? And but it didn't take long at first. I mean, at first it was a little contentious, but where these two communities of practice actually collided with each other. But after a while, as we did ninth grade, and then we worked with the ninth graders to figure out where the 10th grade should be, which was in an old carousel building, and the 11th grade was located on another building. And finally, the students said, I said, where would you like to put the 12th grade? And they said, we want to put it in the train station because we're out of here. So the kids had everything to do with co-designing the school with the educators. And so we did it all together as a group, as a team. So I think that's what we mean by when we say community-centered. What we mean is that everybody's involved in the process, like barn raising. There's no.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
In the museum, the visitors of the museum, were they told that there's a school inside, and did they at times interact with the students?
Yes, it became, everybody had permission to interact with everybody. Now, it took a while for this new way of thinking about a school to, I mean, there were lots of glitches that had to be worked out along the way. Glitches having to do with safety, glitches having to do with distraction. But after a while, the curators finally realized that these students were actually working for them. Because the students would write papers about or do experiments on their objects, and so they would learn from the students. So it became this. It became a system where, and it is now, it's still a system, and it's been replicated a few times, where it's a synergistic kind of learning and museological experience.
Wow, fantastic.
So the word that we often use is nexus. It's a kind of a nexus of things coming together. It's not one thing or the other. It's a nexus of things.
Yeah. Well, you know, I wrote this down when you said that the Ripley Center was a nexus of buildings. These words are very, very much in sync with the systems view of life. You're talking about relationships, you're talking about a nexus, you're talking about various domains of community life. I mean, in my work, I have developed this synthesis of the systems view of life that integrates various dimensions of life, as I call them, the biological, the social, the cognitive, and the ecological. I think that's very much related to what you call domains of community life.
Yes, and we're always learning more and more about what happens in each one of those domains and whether they are the only domains at this point.
Okay, so can we move on to your next example?
Yeah, the next example is actually, as I said, it's a collection of buildings, and it was created by a group called an NGO called the Neighborhood Centers Incorporated in Houston. And it was built to address the needs of a very large immigrant population. Actually, this part of Houston, which is in the neighborhood called Gulfton, has been called the new Ellis Island in this country because there are 90 nationalities represented there. With most of the people who live there are immigrants, and they come into this country with no prior knowledge. So we had a series of community meetings where we in multiple languages, where we were engaging with the community to tell us what their needs were. We want to start with that. That's the function of the center. And they came back and they said, well, you know, the summary was that we need a welcome center. We need a place where people can come when they don't speak the language, and somebody can help them figure out how to fill out forms. They can help them figure out what programs might be available for them to get food, to get shelter, or whatever. So there was a need for some kind of a central hub welcoming center. They also said they need a health clinic because they don't have Blue Cross. They don't have, they come with nothing. So they need access to health. They also said they need a business incubator because many of these immigrants actually have businesses, had businesses in their previous places of life. But they might be doctors, but they're not registered in this country, or there might be lawyers, but they can't practice or whatever. So they needed ways to figure out how to create businesses that where they could support themselves. They didn't want to be on welfare. They also needed an elementary school for their children. They needed a credit union because a lot of people who are in these positions are subject to a lot of predatory lending practices. Similarly, they felt they needed a tax preparation center because the people were taking advantage of them and getting their taxes done. They needed a town hall where they could meet. And we actually combined that with the gymnasium so that they can have sports and also a performing arts center. So it's all 3 in 1. They needed a community arts center because these different people came with lots of different arts and their arts and culture and their belief systems. They felt they need to express. So we have a community arts center located there.
Can I ask you again, Stephen, to elicit these needs from the community and to engage the community? I suppose you need certain skills. And what are these skills? And did you acquire them because they're not traditional architectural skills? Or do you have specialists who are community organizers or social workers or something like that? How does that work?
Well, the way it works is that we do have some of those. We now have Bobby Hill as a full-time community engagement specialist. So Concordia, we are fully dedicated to and have spent a lot of time researching and developing techniques for authentic community engagement. In addition to that, we always work in partnerships because Neighborhood Centers Incorporated is the NGO that's building this project. They have sociologists, they have social programming, they have we all work to get. Whenever we find a need, we always can find somebody to fill it. So the answer is no, we don't have all that expertise, at least not in our shop. But we see ourselves as team players, and so we're connected. Whenever we see a need, we go find. If we don't have, then we go find somebody that has the expertise in that need, and then we all become a part of the same team. So all of this, if anybody's interested in these projects, they can certainly find them on our website, concordia.com. But because there's a lot more than I can talk about. I mean, or they can look through at Neighborhood Centers Incorporated website and see how it's functioning all the time. There's some wonderful testimonials from people who have been to this place and who live with this place every day. So it's not the architectures per se. Well, let's put it this way. It's not the buildings. It's really, it's all of the architecture, all of the components of program.
It seems to me, right from the beginning, when you started talking about barn raising, it seemed to me that decentralization is a key principle that you are applying. Because when you say, you don't have the experts, so you look for them, you form alliances, relationships. And of course, decentralization is a critical principle now in many organizations when we move from seeing an organization as a machine to recognizing that it's more of a network or should be more of a network. So it seems to me that you're applying that principle.
Yes, we are. Sometimes people say, how big is Concordia? And we have a commitment to be plus or minus a dozen people. And we've been that way for 35 years. But we take on projects much bigger than it. Where they say we box bigger than our weight, because the way we do that is through partnerships.
Mm-hmm. And so then you work very near to Berkeley. I often go to Emeryville, and I should look up that center next time I go there.
That's right on San Pablo Avenue, and it started years ago in a conversation that I had with a gentleman named Tony Smith. who ran an organization called the Bay Area Alliance, and it was an education organization. And I had to know, to me, the best of all worlds. I just written some policy work for the U.S. Department of Education called Schools as Centers of Community, where we look at schools as not just being isolated from the community, but being integrated with the community. And at nights and weekends, the school becomes a place where people can have their meetings, and the classrooms that are used for history in the daytime could be used for workforce development at night. And the auditorium becomes a community auditorium and not just a school auditorium. And the gymnasium becomes a community fitness center, so that we can reuse a lot of these resources by optimizing their use over time. So the optimization has always been an interest of mine. So because that feels like we waste so much. You know, the school has a library, the city has a library, the school has a fitness center or a gymnasium, and the YMCA builds a fitness center right down the block. And so what's wrong with this picture? So there was an 8-acre site there that had a high school on it. And Tony and I were able to convince the city and the school district to join forces because the city has some needs. The city council had some needs, the mayor, and the school had some needs. So why not join forces and solve both problems at once? Well, I have to tell you that it took an active legislature in California to allow these two public entities to work together and to co-develop a project. They weren't allowed to collaborate. What happened was the city ended up putting in $25 million and the school ended up putting in $70 million. So now we have a $95 million resource for the community. That's not a school and it's not a community center. It's a combination of a school and community center all in one. We think we saved probably 20% of the taxpayers' money by combining these resources and optimizing these spaces. So it took a couple of years of a lot of multi-stakeholder community meetings, but everybody at the end came to a conclusion that they wanted to have an early childhood center, they wanted to have a pre-K to 12 campus, they wanted to have they wanted the community gym, the gym to be a community gym and swimming pool. They wanted the track and sports field to be used for soccer, community soccer, as well as school sports events. They wanted a health clinic, similar to the folks in Houston. They wanted a teen center and a senior center. They wanted a town hall place to meet. They wanted a library. The goal was to do one library for the community and the school. Now, all of these things didn't come to fruition yet because it takes a while for all of these relationships to connect.
Stephen, that reminds me that, you know, I'm a tennis player and I play tennis every week in Berkeley. And most of the time I play on tennis courts that belong to a school. Berkeley has about maybe 50 tennis courts and every high school has a tennis court. And so informally, that's already done. That, you know, the public uses the tennis court belonging to the school, and you picked that up and enlarged it. Yes,
and that might happen in Berkeley, and it happens less often in other places. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes the school is concerned about insurance, or they're concerned about safety, or they have a whole list of concerns. And so a lot of that, what happened in this process was breaking down those concerns, especially concerns about safety. So you can imagine, you know, the high school kids, high school parents of smaller kids are worried about their children being on the same campus with high school kids, for example. And if you, I could spend a lot of time going through all of the iterations of conversations and negotiations that had to take place in order to make this project work. But we are so committed to our silos, and it does take a little bit of a Herculean effort to break those silos down sometimes.
So a large part of your activity must consist in facilitating meetings and facilitating this design process. That's also a very special skill. And I suppose the the members of your team by now all have that skill.
That's right. It's actually a part of the ethos of our organization. Everybody who works in our organization understands and is passionate about this notion of engaging the stakeholders. Because, I mean, the question is, who are we designing for, us or them? Not us. I mean, as you said, there's always something involved in any creative process where the creator is going to have, the creator's mark is going to be made. But we think it's most important that the mark is made from the people who are going to be living with it every day.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about creativity. You know, in the systems view of life, I say that creativity is a capacity inherent in all life, because we have discovered that living systems have this property that every now and then there's a spontaneous emergence of something new, of novelty, of new order, of new behavior. And complexity theory has elucidated the details of this dynamic. And so then when you realize that every living system, including, of course, every community, is creative, then leadership becomes the facilitation of creativity. It becomes the skill of preparing an environment in which creativity is maximized. How does this look from your perspective and your experience? How do you do that?
I couldn't agree with you more that that the creative process, at the core of the creative process, I would say that it's kind of like a little bit more like a jazz band than an orchestra, or than a classical orchestra, where in the classical orchestra you have the conductor who's telling everybody, now you play, now you play, now you play, based on the script. Whereas in a jazz band, and maybe this, you know, I'm from New Orleans, so we do jazz down here.
Yeah.
In a jazz band, everybody's playing together, you know, and they're playing off of each other. They're what they call riffing off of each other. So it's not so top down as you described. It's more of it's a collaborative. The whole process is a collaborative process, and there is leadership, but the leadership is a collaborative leadership, not a dictatorial leadership.
And since creativity is very much associated with the arts, as you say, with giving the example of jazz, do you have artists as significant contributors in your team?
We have people on our staff who are artists. Yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
We don't have all architects. We have artists. We have people from different kinds of life. We don't.
I mean, architecture has an artistic component anyway, also traditionally, right?
It's supposed to, yeah. Yeah, it depends on what you mean by art.
Yeah.
I think that you know what, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, you know, one of my favorite forms of architecture is the old great cathedrals, right? The Chartres Cathedral is a great cathedral. It's interesting to know that nobody really knows who designed the Chartres Cathedral.
Yeah, yeah.
It's an anonymous building. And not only that, but it wasn't possible for a single person to design it, because it was built over hundreds of years. Right. So it's a good example of a process that was much like what you just described. It's a creative process where everybody brought their creativity to the process. And it's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. And some people say, you know, you can't, a horse is a camel a camel is a horse that was designed by a committee. You know, I say that a horse is a camel that was designed by the community.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I've always been amazed at how harmonious and complete these cathedrals look. And then when you go into the history, you see that they started in the 12th century with a totally different design. And then there were fires and destructions. They redesigned them. And as you say, it went over generations and generations. And yet the outcome is very harmonious.
Yes. Because they were designed based on universal principles.
Mm-hmm.
That's another piece, that could be another conversation we can have, is about how we're not designing based on one of our egos, then what are we designing based on? And what I believe is that, it's not possible to eliminate our egos, but it is possible to guide our egos through the use of universal principles.
Mm-hmm.
And those cathedrals, those cathedrals were designed based on sacred geometry, and the craftspeople who built them all understood the tools of sacred geometry. And that's, by the way, the reason why they can be harmonious, because everybody understood the process, everybody understood the tools, the whole community understood the tools.
And that's why they are beautiful, because beauty essentially is harmony and is patterns and proportions and relationships. How do you see beauty? Have you thought much about that?
About what?
About beauty. What's the nature of beauty, or the essence of beauty?
I'm glad you said the nature of beauty, because I believe that the source of beauty is nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've gotten so far away from nature in our daily lives and in the way we operate, that we've forgotten some of these very precious connections. So my short answer is beauty is, somebody once says, well, you can't have a building that pleases everybody, or you can't design something that pleases everybody. And I go like, wait a minute, what about flowers? Show me an ugly flower. Yeah. Because flowers are all designed based on a set of really cohesive and actually deeply spiritual and sacred principles.
Yeah, and they even, it seems they even please insects because they attract the pollinators.
Yes. That's right. If we could only understand all of those principles, then we wouldn't be having buildings that make people.
Well, we're working on it.
I know.
So
thank you for that.
Let's move on. And it seems to me that you started out with the Henry Ford Museum with a small community. Then in Emeryville and in Houston, it's a larger community. But you go still larger and engage even larger communities, right?
Yeah, one example, because we do architecture, but we also do urban design, and
I see.
So it's a different scale, but it's like fractal. It's same principles that apply at different scales. Yeah. So an example of a project that we did was when we coordinated the recovery plan for New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. That was an overwhelming responsibility because 80% of the city was underwater. There had already been two planning processes that did not engage with the community. One that the mayor initiated, which failed, and then another one that the city council initiated, which failed. And so philanthropy came in at the last minute. The Rockefeller Foundation came at the last minute and said, oh my gosh, it's February after the storm was in August and there's still no plan. So they funded a process that we led that engaged 9,000 people in the recovery process in 5 months. So we had 50 community meetings, we had 3 citywide meetings. And we're proud to say also that we were able to have participation in that process that was equal to the ethnic distribution of the population before the storm. So we had 65% of the people engaged in that process were African American from birth, and they were living in many, many different cities. So we had to work in what we call the diaspora while we were doing that, Houston and Dallas and Atlanta, in order to get those populations. So it was quite a challenging process, but at the end of the day, the whole city of New Orleans, our new mayor actually is an African-American woman who participated at the neighborhood level as a neighborhood organizer in that process. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of outcomes. The whole educational system is different now as a result of the work that was done during that planning process. Mm-hmm. And some of it done in the previous planning process, because what we did is we took those previous planning processes and unified them together and moved them forward. with community engagement as the center of it. So anyway, the bottom line is that it's possible to work at these much larger scales. And the way we did that was we brought on to the team 12 urban planning firms from all around the country. I mentioned earlier about working, collaboratively so that we can expand our reach.
I was thinking, while you were talking, I was thinking about Puerto Rico, because the same thing happens there now. All kinds of people have all kinds of ideas, and many of them are failures. Has anybody contacted you from Puerto Rico, or have you thought about that?
We are doing some work in the Caribbean. I'm not prepared to take on Puerto Rico at this point, frankly. I'm looking at it and keeping track of it. But that whole process is extremely complex.
Yeah.
And so we've focused our attention on the island of Dominica right now. And we've been working with the Kalinago Indians, who are 3,000 strong. They used to be the Carib Indians that occupied all the Caribbean islands, and through years of annihilation, now they're reduced to only 3,000 people on 3,700 acres of pristine rainforest on the northeast corner of Dominica. So we're working with them to develop some models and some prototypes that we hope we would be able to apply throughout the Caribbean. These are prototypes that would engage, for example, the Kalinago people in building their own homes using the lumber. Some of the lumber that's been destroyed by the hurricane, we can take that lumber and use that lumber to build homes and build an industry of home building. And that the Kalinago people can get paid to build their own homes back. They can build their schools, and they could even export that in a circular economy. So that's the work that we are doing in the Caribbean at this point, is working with one of the oldest indigenous populations on the planet, and learning from them. We are learning so much about why they've lasted for 4,000 years. So, yeah.
I was also thinking about this example of Curitiba in Brazil. I'm sure you're familiar with Jaime Lerner's work there, because in his urban design, he also engaged the community. He engaged homeless people and all kinds of levels of community to improve the city.
Yes, he did, and he was a friend of our mutual friend, Dr. Leonard Duell, and that's how I got to know about Jaime Lerner. And but you're right, absolutely right. There are great examples all around the world of this kind of work that we are learning from.
Oh, wonderful! Do you think we should move into questions? Are you ready for that, or do you want to talk more about Dominica?
No, I'm done. I would love. I'm ready to learn now. I've said all I can say.
Okay, so we'll ask Phoebe to present us with the questions.
Great. Yeah, we've already had quite a lot of questions, so I was thinking it might be nice to start early with the questions, and then we've got 25 minutes. I'm sure they'll spark quite a lot more conversation. So we started with a question from Stephen. A question for Stephen, sorry, from Joyce and Bill Gilbert from Tracy, California. And their question is, Stephen, how do you choose which projects to get involved in?
I don't choose them, they choose me. They show up. And
but you don't accept everything. You can't accept everything that is brought to you, no?
No, and I mean, we do have a filter, and if people are intentional about doing, if they're passionate about working in community, we would have a hard time turning them down. Not everybody is interested in these ideas. Some people like being in control, and that's not who we are.
And do you get more offers, more requests than you can handle, or could you handle more, or are you just about even?
No, we always have room for another a great opportunity to learn. We are a learning organization. I would say that's one of the criteria that we use is if there's an opportunity for us to do something that we haven't done before, then we would rather do that than to do something all over again. But we're always interested in it's more about relationships as far as I'm concerned. If somebody really wants to do the right thing, as we define the right thing, I guess you could say, which is authentically engaging the community and working with goodwill in the process and focusing on the end users, then we can find the time. We have partnerships that we can bring in to expand those capabilities. I wouldn't turn anybody down, let's put it that way.
Okay, do you have more?
Yes, there are more. So we have a question from David, who asks, Stephen, have you worked with co-housing communities? How do co-housing principles mesh or not with what you are talking about here?
I'll tell you, I've never done a co-housing project, but I've always wanted to. And I think co-housing, we're spending more and more time moving into this affordable housing arena, especially affordable housing. So affordable co-housing would be really attractive to me.
I have a question actually just writing off the back of that, if you don't mind. Have you heard about this new movement that's happening around kind of modern villages? So, eco and villages that have kind of technological, like tech ecological villages. There's somewhat of a movement going on, and people are saying it's like the future because people don't want to live in cities anymore. They prefer to live in these modern villages just outside the city.
Right, and smart cities, right?
Right.
Yeah, and that is, there's always a cycle in urban planning that goes from people moving out of the city and people moving back into the city. So we're now in the cycle of people. We just went through the cycle of all people moving back to the city, and now people are going and reversing it back and going back out into rather the suburbs. Right now, we have a new name for suburbs, which is the smart cities. Right. So my only concern about some of that is it going to end up being suburbs all over again? And if they're ecologically sound, how are they ecologically sound? I believe that we have put way too much of our emphasis on technology. So this whole Internet of Things is suspicious as far as I'm concerned. Because all the technology I've ever used breaks eventually. And so what happens when we have so much of our investment in technology and it all starts coming apart? I'm much more interested in the lessons that I'm learning from Chief Nietzsche Abo in the Kalinago territory about how you can live without technology. And you can live a beautiful life. So I'll leave you with that.
Thanks.
As the answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. I'll ask somebody else's question. So Mafia has just asked, when working with government bodies to shape community resilience, if you're authentically engaging the community with what their needs are, do you find that the government bodies have a fear of decentralizing power, and how do you deal with that, if so?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. It's just a little bit strange somehow that we have mostly this democratic process, and yet people don't necessarily trust the community. So fortunately, we've been at this long enough that we can pretty much assure the authorities that we're not going to have somebody stand up in a microphone and throw the whole thing under the bus. We have a process that's very respectful of the community. The people in the community understand that they're being respected, and so it takes a while, but eventually the people who are in leadership positions understand that this is actually a better way to do it than standing up and getting tomatoes thrown at them in every city council meeting and every school board meeting.
Nice. Richard, do you have anything to add there, or shall I move on to the next?
No, I'm just very happy about these questions. These are really excellent questions, and I'm just listening enthralled. So go ahead.
Great. I will move on to another one. Here's one about democracy. So from Nicole. Nicole asks, in your introduction, you mentioned your focus and commitment to democracy. Can you elaborate a bit on how you see your work supporting and strengthening democracy?
Well, gosh, that's a big one. I'll just touch on it. I really believe that democracy, in order for us to build our democracy better, we have to have better communication. And communication can't come on the 6 o'clock news. That's not how we need to get our communication. Our communication needs to be between people, in building relationships. And the way to build relationships is to work together. And so being an architect and an urban planner, my job is to make things happen. There has to be a product at the end of the day. And engaging people in making that happen, this kind of project-based democracy, if you will, is the contribution that I feel like we can make. I'm not sure how we can only make a little contribution. We have a much bigger challenge than that, but that's the contribution we can make. Kind of project, in education they have this thing called project-based learning. I sort of feel like we're project-based architects. We're community-centered. We call ourselves community-centered architects.
Let me add something to that, Stephen. Some time ago, I read a book which you may know by Randolph Hester, and it's called Design for Ecological Democracy. And he makes the point that democracy, real democracy, can only work if you have an engaged and active community. And he's an urban designer, and he was a professor at Berkeley for 20 years. And he says that our cities are not designed to further community. On the contrary, they inhibit community. But what you do is the opposite. You engage the community and you enhance the community. And so I think you're making more than a small contribution for democracy. You're really, shoring up the very essence of democracy, which is community.
Well, thank you, Fritjof. That's very kind of you to say that. I will tell you that I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Virginia, and so you can't grow up in Virginia without learning about the foundation of our democracy. And the thing that rings true for me is something that I've always thought about many times. As Thomas Jefferson said, that democracy depends on the goodness and the wisdom of the common people. And I think we've lost touch with that goodness and that wisdom. And however, all of us can in whatever domains of practice we're operating, however we can get back to the point where we can respect each other and bring and believe in that goodness and that wisdom. And I think maybe we'll have a shot at getting there.
I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. There was another question about democracy that might come in nicely here. Let's see. Okay, here's another one from Nicole. Following my question on democracy, how do you help the individual members of the community understanding the whole community needs in the decision-making process?
By putting them in the same room together, number one. And then putting them at tables of 8 people. We don't have some lecturer at the front of the room telling everybody what the answer is. We have people working at tables of 8 people at a table, and they talk to each other. And so and we've had meetings as we've had 1,500 people in one room with 8 people at a table. So 1,500 people can all talk to each other if they're talking 8 people at a time. Jeff, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
how did you arrive at the number 8? Is this the kind of tables you have, or did you arrive at it by experience?
It could be 6. It could be. 8 seems to be a good number. I don't know. We've done a number of different sizes, but somehow we just gravitated to 8. 10 is too many, you know. And 6 works, but 4 is not enough.
Yeah. Great.
And there might be some, you know, say if 4 people only want to work together, then they'll go find a table and 4 people will sit, and they'll throw the 4 people out or whatever. But they seek their own level.
I have been in meetings and processes like this, and I'm always amazed how people establish conceptual relationships between various parts of the problem, and at the same time they establish human relationships. So there's this interplay between conceptual and human relationships. And of course, you know, for a systems thinker, this is paradise, you know, because it's a beautiful illustration of systems thinking.
So I want to emphasize something that we talked about earlier, all the way back to barn raising. What they're doing at that table is they're working. They're not just talking to each other.
Yeah.
We're asking them to give us input. What are your community assets? You know, we spent a whole meeting mapping community assets. We spent another meeting mapping the community's needs. And if you take if you subtract the community's assets from the community's needs, the needs are almost always bigger than the assets. Then you end up with a plan. You know, okay, well, now we're going to fill the gaps between what you need and what you have. So it's a fairly simple process that people understand, and then we put them to work. You know, they're talking to each other, but there's an output, so people feel good about the work that they've done.
Great.
And there are a couple of more points I wanted to make. One is that we also assign a person from the community to be the table host. And so we don't just throw 8 people together. We actually train, as I mentioned, my business partner, Bobby Hill, has a whole curriculum to train people in the community to be community fellows, we call them. So they're like citizen planners, right? So we're not doing the work, they're doing the work.
So you really have developed a structure and quite an elaborate process to engage the community.
That's right. That's why we know it won't go off the rails. You know, it's so many, as we mentioned earlier, that a lot of political leaders are wary of a room full of people. That's like their worst nightmare. It's a room full of people with a microphone. And because people stand up at a microphone and berate their public elected officials. But that's a destructive way of doing community engagement. There are constructive ways of doing community engagement, and frankly, it's always involves putting the community to work.
Great. Phoebe, do you have another question?
Well, I'm having this image of, I'm wondering whether Concordia sees itself as a facilitator of kind of citizen networks that can slowly build their own, you know, urban planning and democratic housing. Is that correct?
I couldn't quite understand that.
So I'm wondering whether Concordia is a facilitator of kind of building these citizen networks, because you're bringing together groups of citizens around the world to plan their own, to do their own urban planning.
I can't understand the question. It's breaking up.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Hello?
I think we're frozen.
Oh dear. One moment. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Is that back in connection? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's choppy on my end as well. So I know, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't hear the question.
Okay, so the question I was asking was whether you see Concordia as a facilitator of networks of citizens who basically do their own urban planning, as opposed to a top-down.
Let me see. It's still choppy.
Right. Is that any better?
Okay, it's better now.
Great.
I can hear you, Phoebe.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I think that there was a bit of a disruption to the internet. So what I was asking, sorry for the third time, was that I'm wondering whether you see Concordia as a facilitator, networks of citizens who come together to do their own urban planning. So instead of a kind of top-down
Yes.
architecture company, it sounds like it's much more about convening and facilitating.
Yes, it is. And we also see ourselves as a resource provider in that we try to do research and we try to understand best practices so that we can present a number of scenarios for the community to choose from, because the community doesn't have time necessarily. I mean, if some people come with ideas, then they put their ideas on the table. The more ideas, the better. And so our job is to have as many ideas on the table, and then we go back and we process all that. You know, all the work that people did, we go back and we process it, and we come back to the next meeting and say, this is what we heard. And we have a ground truthing in the very beginning. Is this really what you said? And then we move on from there. And it's an iterative process where we're building it with the community. Yes, facilitation is more the way of describing it.
Something connected to that is a question from Karin, who asks, in terms of authentic participation, is the process induced or organic? So who would approach you? Would it be the community or an authority or foundation?
All of the above.
Right.
We've worked for we've been approached, and we've had our clients have been all of the above.
Great. So we're at 7:05, so we've still got about 10 minutes. Here's quite a direct question from Miron, who asks, what are your principles?
Concord.
Harmony,
and agreement. That's everything we do is trying to get to that. And you know, I remember back when I first started thinking about Concordia, I thought the best thing to do is to make a company so that with a goal that you can never reach. So we'll always just get a little closer. We're never going to.
Great. Let's have another question. How do you or you and your team overcome the barriers of silos and hierarchical working? This is from Miron again. I'm in the process of a radical co-design in the health sector in England and France now. How does your co-design process work?
Well, it works. I think I was, it works all the ways that we've just been talking about. But another way it works is that we actually do have, as Fritjof mentioned, we do have a structure. It's hard to explain that structure in a simple sentence or a simple, 2-minute answer. But we do look at we do physical. Simply put, we do holistic planning. Right? Systemic planning. We do physical planning, cultural planning, social planning, economic planning, educational planning, all at the same time. We don't do one or the other. And that's why we get a room full of people who have this expertise. People come from the community. They're the experts on the culture of the community. Many of the people who come understand the economics of the community. If not, we go and have one-on-one meetings with people who understand, the economics of the community or the economics of the project. So I guess it probably sounds a little maddening to try to do a planning project or an architectural design project that incorporates all of those different domains. But what we found is that there are people in those domains, the communities of practice that Fritjof mentioned, that are out there. They're very willing to help. strong ideas, and they have aspirations, and they have visions of their own. And all we have to do sometimes is just cut them loose.
Stephen, let me ask you something. Are there people who have come to you and asked you for your techniques, or have you made them public? Are you interested in spreading this system, training other people to form their own practices?
Yes, we are. And we are, in fact, we are working with some of the researchers at Stanford University now. There did some research projects at Stanford University on sort of crowdsourcing and design to develop a more complete version of our curriculum. We have a curriculum for training, as I mentioned earlier, about training community fellows. So now we're ramping up that curriculum to address the very issue you just described. So how can we not build Concordia into some giant company that none of us is happy with? You know, I want to stay happy. That's my main thing. I should say that's harmony. That is my goal. I want to stay happy. So the same principle that I mentioned earlier about networks of people, we do that all the time to expand our reach. And we realize that we can't do it every time on projects. So we have come to the understanding that we're now literally beginning the process of developing this curriculum that we'd be happy to share with people about how all of these pieces fit together. It's hard to talk about because, you know, it's like you're the fish in the water, you don't know what water is, right? So we've been doing it for so long that we have to like stand back and say, how do we do it?
I have a question from Thomas, who it's quite a long question, but it's got someone else asking me to ask it. So here we go. Thomas says, you mentioned levels of organization and fractal reflection, and I'm curious if there is a voice for self-actualization of the individual as I speak inside the personal well-being sciences. Is the optimization of the individual relevant, incentivized, and possibly even mandatory to enter humanity as organism community conversations?
That sounds like a Fritjof question.
Yeah, I was thinking the same. I was going to say this is something I could have asked.
Well, now you get to answer it. So I want to ask you to answer that question. That's too big for me.
Fritjof, would you like to read the question again, or?
No, it just, I would say, if I were Stephen, I would say, if you have these teams of 8 people at a table, you know, working on problems, if each of these 8 people is, you know, very capable, energetic, and self-actualized, to use Thomas's term, then they will find solutions much easier, and the creativity of the table will be enhanced. So of course there's an interplay between the individual capacities and the capacity of the group.
I will say this in response to that. My contribution is that to the answer to this question is that we have seen a lot of if you want to call it self-actualization, that comes out of this process. People do keep going. You know, we sometimes measure our success in many ways by when we're gone. You know, are people still meeting with each other? Are they still having those conversations? Mm-hmm. Because if it's about us, if it's just about us, then what's the point? You know, if the consultant's gone and then everybody leaves, then we haven't really done our job. So I can point to a number of projects where when we're gone, the process keeps going. And people, we've trained some people to be community fellows and community planners and citizen planners to the point where they just keep planning. And that's, to me, the dream of all dreams of outcomes, is that people are empowered, personally empowered, to do something they might not have done otherwise.
Yeah, I was just at a seminar in California of 5 days, and on one day, one of the speakers didn't show up, and so that session of an hour had to be cancelled, and it was in the late afternoon, and we said, well, let's just end earlier, and you have a free hour between now and dinner. And what happened was nobody left the room, and they formed small groups and continued the conversation. So we thought this was a successful seminar, and you are saying the same thing.
Yes. Yeah, we depend too many times on the experts, right?
Right.
I really like not having to be an expert. I think it's a good thing not to be an expert sometimes. If people would like to know more, I could make some references. If you want to Google Creating Breakout Innovation is the project that Stanford University Global Project Center took on. And it was published in Stanford Innovation Review. And it gets at some of these things we just talked about.
I think it's great to share resources if you want to share any more.
Engagement and authentic engagement, and refer you to a website that is called commonedge.org. It's meaning to bring together the common ground of universal knowledge with the creative edge of discovery and innovation. So it proposes a radical middle ground called the common edge. So I'll refer you to that. Some 200 and some essays on that site so far about these same ideas that we just talked about. What my colleague Martin Peterson calls the radical middle ground.
Just going to mute Fritjof.
Yeah, I just want to say that this was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed that. And Stephen, thank you so much for spending time with us. And it was really illuminating. And I will leave the last word to Phoebe to conclude.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. So I just had a comment from Karen saying that saying thank you for the conversation, and that it's a highly confirmatory conversation regarding the work that she is doing in an architecture department, I assume in a university, where the curriculum is being radically transformed to be more responsive to social development. And she asks if you would be willing to be in touch through email. Yeah, absolutely
happy to do that. I'm committed to the understanding that in order to get to a different place, we have to start with how we train our architects. And so I'm delighted to hear that some of these ideas might resonate. I would also refer people, if you want to learn more about these projects, you're welcome to log into our website, concordia.com. And all the projects I mentioned and many more are on that website. And also welcome if anybody wants to email me. I love these kinds of communications, and I can't have too many. So don't hold back. sbingler@concordia.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Maybe if after this conversation, I can email you and collect the links to all the resources that you've mentioned and put them on our alumni network platform and on our Capricorns Facebook page.
Sure.
That would be great. So thank you. Yeah, just to thank both you, Stephen, and Fritjof for a very inspiring conversation. We really covered a lot of ground, and I think there's a lot of food for thought and some great links and things to follow up with. So to everybody listening, it would be great. Please do give your feedback and any suggestions on the format of this Capricorns webinar, because we plan to do a series. So it'd be great to hear from you. You can email me at capracoursepub, so CAPRACOURSEPUB @gmail.com, and I'd be really happy to hear your feedback. feedback and suggestions, because we'd love to, to make these as participatory and engaging as possible. So we're planning to follow up with another webinar perhaps in early September. And finally, I just wanted to remind everybody about the registration for the fall 2018 edition Capra course, where a lot of these similar conversations happen within our alumni network. And there are many of the themes we've touched on in this conversation appear also in the Capra course and the systems view of life. So far, we've had people from 10 countries join in the Americas, in Europe, in Asia, Oceania, who have already enrolled. So we really hope you will consider enrolling to our global course. And with that, I will close the conversation. Thanks again, Stephen, and thank you, Fritjof, and thanks to everybody who joined us.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great evening or day. Bye.